There was a time when the most dangerous object in an American home wasn't a gun or a bottle of whiskey or a bag of heroin from a dark alley. It was a small amber bottle sitting quietly behind a bathroom mirror, a white tablet stamped with a simple name, OxyContin. Let me take you back to that medicine cabinet. Suburban house, good school district, 2-car garage. A parent opens the door, reaches past toothpaste and vitamins, and twists off the childproof cap. One pill for a bad back, a knee injury, post-surgery pain. It looks harmless. Controlled. Modern science doing its job. Now pull the camera back. Past the cul-de-sac, above the highway, out over a town where factories have closed, jobs have vanished, and entire neighborhoods are hollowed out by addiction. The same pill, the same name, a very different life. OxyContin was not just another prescription. Not only was it the most influential pain pill of its era, it became the chemical engine of a new kind of empire. Purdue Pharma took an old drug, opioid pain relief, and repackaged it as a breakthrough, then turned human suffering into a multi-billion-dollar business. From 1996 to 2000, sales exploded from tens of millions to over $1 billion a year, powered by sales reps, glossy brochures, and a simple promise, long-lasting relief with a low risk of addiction. Because of that promise, and because of the ruthless marketing behind it, the consequences were historic. Between 1999 and 2019, nearly 250,000 Americans died from prescription opioid overdoses. Entire regions, especially Appalachia and the Rust Belt, watched pain pills flood in as coal jobs and steel jobs disappeared. County budgets were drained by emergency calls and foster care. Main streets filled with pawn shops and pill mills. Families that had lived in the same town for generations were suddenly selling heirlooms to pay for a habit that started with a doctor's note. On paper, this was medicine. In practice, it's an example of what happens when a company discovers that every new ache, every workplace injury, every surgery is also a sales opportunity. Doctors were assured addiction was rare, while internal documents tracked high prescribing clinics that looked more like cash registers than clinics. Was this a tragic accident of modern pharmacology, or the predictable outcome of a calculated strategy built on half-truths, cherry-picked science, and hidden data? The story of Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family is not at times inspiring and at times chilling. It is chilling from the start. Ahead are secret memos and manipulated studies, pain societies funded into loyalty, pill mills in strip malls, overdoses in church parking lots, and billion-dollar settlements that arrived long after the wealth was secured and the damage was done. Museums quietly scraped a family name off their walls. The pills and the grief remained. And to understand how a quiet pill bottle rewrote American pain, the story has to begin with the company that taught the country to swallow it. The company behind that bottle was not a faceless bureaucracy. It was a family project. On one side, the Sackler name glowed from the marble wings of the Met, the Louvre, the Tate. Galleries, university buildings, medical schools carried it like a seal of culture and wealth. On the other side, that same family quietly controlled Purdue Pharma, the engine that would turn a single opioid pill into a nationwide wound. There was a time when the Sacklers were known less for courtrooms and more for champagne galas. They posed with curators, endowed professorships, and wrapped themselves in the language of healing and human progress. This was the public story of a generous medical dynasty. But behind the museum plaques was another story. A private empire built on understanding exactly how doctors think, how patients hope, and how pain could be packaged, branded, and sold. Because of their training in medical advertising, the Sacklers grasped something new about the late 20th century healthcare system. If a company could convince physicians that chronic pain was wildly undertreated, that opioids were safe for long-term use, and that one particular pill was the modern scientific answer, then the money would follow. Not just millions, billions. It's an example of what happens when marketing genius is pointed directly at the most vulnerable parts of public health. So this is not just a business case about a successful product launch. It is a moral parable about unchecked greed, branding, and the weaponization of trust. Purdue did not simply sell OxyContin. It sold reassurance. It sold the idea that addiction was rare, that time-release coatings made old dangers disappear, that pain relief could be as polished and premium as a luxury good. At times inspiring and at times chilling, their rise shows how far a company will go when no one in power says no soon enough. Over the course of this video, the story will trace the full arc. From Purdue's early days as a sleepy, almost anonymous drug maker in the post-war era, to the aggressive OxyContin years when sales exploded from tens of millions to over $1 billion annually in just 4 years, to the flood of lawsuits, the guilty pleas, the carefully engineered bankruptcy, and the ongoing fights over whether justice was done or merely negotiated. His story is one of relentless expansion, but here, the his is a family brand rather than a single man. The Sacklers leveraged philanthropy to buy prestige, leveraged prestige to buy influence, then leveraged influence to protect their money. As overdose deaths climbed and pill mills flourished, the same name that once meant culture became a public liability. Museums that had begged for their donations now scraped the letters off their walls. To understand how any of this was possible, let me take you back to the world that made it easy. A post-war pharmaceutical industry learning the power of television, glossy journals, and sales reps. A new kind of medical advertising that treated doctors as customers to be managed, not guardians to be convinced. Before OxyContin could conquer American medicine, that system had to be built. And it was. The next part of this story begins there. There was a time when the most powerful force in American medicine wasn't a breakthrough drug or a brilliant surgeon. It was a man who understood that if you could control what doctors saw, you could control what they prescribed. And if you controlled that, you controlled the money. Let me take you back to mid-20th century New York. Post-war optimism, neon lights, and a booming pharmaceutical industry hungry for growth. In a modest office far from the glamour of Madison Avenue, Arthur Sackler, a trained psychiatrist who moonlighted as an ad man, was quietly rewriting the rules of how drugs entered everyday life. His story is one of medical training fused with marketing instinct, and of a man who saw not just patients and diseases, but a vast, untapped market. At the time, most drug promotion was restrained, even dull. Black and white notices, sober language, an assumption that science spoke for itself. Arthur treated that as a problem to be solved. He flooded medical journals with glossy, full-color ads that looked more like luxury campaigns than clinical notices. Calm, confident physicians gazing at charts, elegant diagrams, reassuring taglines promising control, relief, stability. The message was simple: prescribe this pill, and your patients will thank you, and so will your career. But the real innovation was not the ink on the page, it was the system behind it. Arthur pioneered direct-to-doctor marketing on a scale the industry had never seen, deploying armies of sales reps, personalized mailers, and sponsored educational seminars. He funded continuing education courses, ghost-written articles, and symposia where the speakers were presented as independent experts, even as their travel, fees, and talking points were underwritten by the manufacturer. Science and sales were no longer separate lanes. They were merged into a single, carefully branded experience. The test case was tranquilizers. Working for Roche, Arthur helped launch Librium and then Valium, pitching them as modern solutions to the anxieties of post-war life. Housewives overwhelmed by domestic expectations, businessmen under pressure, veterans struggling in silence, all could be framed as candidates for a pill. Through relentless journal ads, doctor visits, and sponsored lectures, Valium prescriptions exploded, turning it into the best-selling drug in America and a cultural reference point. The lesson was clear. With the right message, prescribing habits across an entire nation could be reshaped in just a few years. Underlying all of this was a cold, coherent mindset. Medicine was a market. Physicians were customers. Scientific authority was a brand asset, something to be purchased, polished, and deployed. Because of that worldview, the white coat became not just a symbol of trust, but a marketing channel. It's an example of what happens when commercial ambition fuses with professional prestige. At times inspiring and at times chilling, this new playbook turned a sleepy industry into a modern empire of influence. And decades later, refined, updated, and made even more ruthless, the same techniques would be pointed at a new kind of pill, one aimed not at anxiety, but at pain, with consequences that would finally spill far beyond the doctor's office. That new pain pill would one day make headlines, but there was a time when the company behind it was almost invisible. Long before congressional hearings and billion-dollar settlements, Purdue was not an empire of pain. It was a quiet little lab with a forgettable name, the Purdue Frederick Company. Let me take you back to mid-century American medicine, when this family's future was still hiding in antiseptic bottles and earwax remover. Purdue Frederick made niche products doctors barely remembered until they reached for them. A surgical disinfectant here, a laxative there, an Otic solution to clear out ears before an exam. Necessary, yes. Glamorous, no. In a market already dominated by giants like Merck and Pfizer, Purdue lived in the shadows, filling tiny gaps the big players did not bother to notice. Into that modest operation stepped three brothers with very different talents and a shared obsession with money, power, and prestige. Arthur Sackler, the eldest, never ran Purdue day to day, but he shaped its soul. He had already made a name in medical advertising, proving that a clever campaign could turn a dull tranquilizer into a blockbuster. To him, a drug was not just chemistry, it was a story to be told, repeated, and finally believed. His younger brothers, Mortimer and Raymond, took the controls of Purdue itself. Mortimer focused on the business, the deals, the flow of cash. Raymond, trained as a psychiatrist, spoke the language of research and clinical respectability. Together, they turned Purdue into a tightly held, family-run enterprise, where the boardroom, the lab, and the dinner table blurred into one continuous strategy session. Decisions did not wander through layers of bureaucracy. They moved from brother to brother, fast, quiet, and coordinated. Because Purdue was small, it lived with constant constraints. It lacked massive sales armies, huge research budgets, and the safety net that let big pharma absorb failure after failure. One bad bet could hurt. One good bet could change the entire trajectory of the family's wealth. That pressure pushed them toward a different kind of advantage: marketing. If they could not outspend the giants, they would outpersuade them, targeting narrow medical niches, building close relationships with doctors, and squeezing every drop of revenue from products most companies would have ignored. This is where the story turns. The company's scale, once a weakness, became a weapon. Purdue could pivot quickly, concentrate its limited resources, and test the Sackler playbook on a smaller stage, experimenting with how to educate physicians, how to frame risk, how to make a new pill feel modern, safe, even humane. It's an example of what happens when a family learns to treat a modest drug maker like a laboratory for influence. By the late 20th century, Purdue had everything in place: a lean manufacturing base, a disciplined sales force, a marketing philosophy at times inspiring and at times chilling, and a family that controlled every lever. All that was missing was a product powerful enough to justify unleashing it all. And when that product finally arrived, the quiet little lab would not stay quiet for long. But Purdue wasn't launching into a vacuum. The world outside that quiet lab was already changing in a way that made a powerful opioid look less like a risk and more like a moral obligation. Let me take you back to the 1980s and early 1990s. There was a time when the great scandal in American medicine wasn't overprescribing, it was undertreating pain. Cancer patients were dying in agony. Post-surgical patients woke up from major operations and received tiny doses of morphine, carefully rationed as if comfort were a luxury instead of part of care. Doctors were taught to fear addiction, so they erred on the side of suffering. Because of that fear, a new movement rose up. Pain specialists, professional societies, and advocacy groups argued that pain had been ignored for too long, that the system was cruel, that medicine, with all its power and wealth, could at least promise people a dignified exit from life. It sounded humane. It was humane. And it created a powerful new story inside hospitals. Pain wasn't just a symptom, it was an emergency. Out of this came a deceptively simple idea. Pain should be measured just like pulse, temperature, blood pressure, and breathing. Pain as the fifth vital sign. Nurses began asking every patient to rate pain on a scale from 0 to 10. Charts were redesigned. Posters went up. If a patient circled an 8 and walked away without relief, that was now a failure, sometimes even a liability. The pressure on clinicians escalated. Hospital administrators tied quality scores, accreditation, even bonuses to reported pain control. Patient satisfaction surveys started asking whether pain had been well managed. A low score could hurt a department. A high score looked like good medicine. In that environment, being aggressive with pain treatment stopped sounding dangerous and started sounding compassionate. And this is where the line began to blur. Opioids, once reserved for end-stage cancer or severe trauma, were slowly rebranded as tools for back pain, arthritis, even routine dental work. Short-acting pills, long-acting pills, patches, injections, all promising that no one needed to live with pain. It's an example of what happens when a real problem meets a very profitable solution. Pharmaceutical companies watched this cultural shift the way a banker watches a gold rush. They funded pain conferences, paid for educational dinners, sponsored continuing education courses that downplayed addiction and emphasized suffering. The mission was framed as noble, almost heroic, end the nation's epidemic of untreated pain. The money, however, flowed in one direction. In that climate, imagine how a drug would sound if it promised powerful all-day relief with a supposedly low risk of addiction. Not like a warning, like a miracle. And Purdue was about to offer exactly that. The only question was how far they were willing to go to make every doctor in America believe it. On paper, the miracle would start with a familiar villain. OxyContin was not new. It was a powerful opioid, a chemical cousin of morphine and heroin, already known in medicine for its ability to crush pain and, just as reliably, to hook people who used it for too long. There was a time when drugs like that were kept mostly for the gravest cases. Late-stage cancer, post-surgical agony, moments when doctors accepted the trade-off. Purdue's idea was not to invent a new molecule. It was to repackage an old one. Let me take you back to the early 1990s, inside Purdue's labs and boardrooms. The vision was simple and ambitious. Wrap OxyContin in a special time-release coating so the pill would dissolve slowly over 12 hours. Instead of a sharp spike of the drug in the blood, there would be a smooth curve, a long, steady plateau. In theory, less rush, less euphoria, less craving. The same power against pain, but without the same reputation for addiction. On a whiteboard, it looked like alchemy. That controlled release shell became the entire sales pitch. Purdue would tell doctors that by stretching out the absorption, OxyContin kept blood levels stable and therefore reduced the classic cycle of high and crash that drove abuse. The company framed the pill as a kind of pharmacological seatbelt. Strong medicine, yes, but engineered to be safer. It's an example of what happens when a scientific detail is slowly polished into a marketing slogan. Inside the company, though, the ambitions went far beyond cancer wards. Executives understood that the real money was not in rare terminal cases, but in the everyday pain that millions lived with. Chronic back pain from warehouse work, arthritis in aging joints, lingering injuries from car crashes and weekend sports. If OxyContin could be prescribed as a long-acting solution for all of that, Purdue wouldn't just have a product. It would have an empire of pain management stretching from small-town clinics to big city hospitals. Even the name was part of the design. Oxycodone-controlled release became OxyContin. Clinical, modern, clean, it didn't sound like morphine with its battlefield imagery or heroin with its criminal shadow. It sounded like something that might sit quietly next to blood pressure pills in a medicine cabinet, a neutral tool rather than a dangerous narcotic. Language did what chemistry alone could not. It distanced the drug from its own family tree. On paper, this was at times inspiring and at times chilling. A powerful opioid tamed by technology, ready to bring relief to millions who had been told to live with their pain. Safer, smoother, longer lasting. That was the promise. But as always, the real danger wouldn't lie only in what the pill was. It would lie in how a ruthless company, chasing wealth and power, chose to sell it to the world. Safer, smoother, longer lasting. That was the promise. But in the mid-1990s, that promise still needed something even more powerful than a time-release coating. It needed a government seal of approval. Without that, OxyContin was just another ambitious pitch from a family-owned drug company. With it, Purdue could claim legitimacy, authority, and the right to rewrite how America thought about pain. Let me take you back to 1995. There was a time when the Food and Drug Administration was under intense pressure to speed new medicines to market, to trust company data, to help innovation rather than slow it down. Purdue submitted its application for OxyContin, loaded with company-generated studies that were short, tightly controlled, and light on long-term follow-up. The FDA reviewers were not running massive independent trials. They were reading Purdue's numbers, Purdue's charts, Purdue's story. On paper, those studies showed what Purdue wanted them to show. Patients in controlled settings, using the pill as directed, reported strong pain relief and relatively low levels of obvious abuse in the short term. What they did not show was what would happen when this powerful opioid met real life. Poverty, stress, injury, trauma, and a medical system already drifting toward quick pharmaceutical fixes. Yet those missing pieces did not stop the process. They simply became blind spots. Inside the dense language of the proposed label, one phrase emerged as the hinge. The FDA allowed wording that OxyContin's delayed absorption was believed to reduce the abuse liability compared to immediate release opioids. That sentence was cautious, hedged, almost nervous. Believed to reduce was not a declaration of fact. It was a theory tied to a specific mechanism and framed as an expectation rather than a guarantee. But once that line was printed on the official label, it gained a new kind of power. Purdue's marketers did not walk into doctors' offices whispering about theoretical mechanisms and limited data. They spoke in confident tones about a pill that was less addictive, less prone to abuse, safer for long-term use. A speculative phrase became a shield. A careful hedge morphed into a sales slogan. It's an example of what happens when a single regulatory sentence meets a ruthless marketing empire hungry for wealth and market share. There was another detail buried in this chapter. The FDA examiner who oversaw OxyContin's original approval later left the agency and went to work for Purdue. The timing was legal, but the optics were devastating. The revolving door between regulator and regulated turned an already controversial approval into a case study in regulatory capture, where the referee can eventually join the winning team and share in the money. By the end of 1995, Purdue finally had everything it needed: a powerful opioid, a time-release story, and now an FDA label that could be weaponized into a promise of lower addiction risk. The pill had its green light and its marketing hook. What Purdue chose to do with that combination would not just change one company's fortune, it would help ignite a national epidemic. But a green light and a marketing hook were not enough. To turn one pill into an empire, Purdue needed something even more powerful than an FDA label. It needed a number that could silence doubt in 10 seconds and turn fear of addiction into confidence. That number was less than 1%. 3 words, 1 statistic, repeated like a magic spell. Sales reps told doctors that fewer than 1 out of 100 patients on opioids became addicted. Training manuals echoed it. Brochures echoed it. Paid pain experts echoed it on conference stages. There was a time when that tiny percentage sounded like a scientific shield, proof that OxyContin could unlock pain relief without unleashing chaos. Let me take you back to where that number really came from. Not from a massive, long-term trial, not from years of careful follow-up in real-world clinics. It came from a short, 5-sentence letter published in 1980 in a medical journal. The authors had looked at hospitalized patients on opioids and noticed that documented addiction appeared in less than 1% of their charts. No randomization, no outpatient follow-up, no tracking what happened once patients went home with bottles in their hands. On its own, that letter was a tiny observation, a footnote in the larger story of pain medicine. The authors never claimed opioids were safe for widespread, long-term use. They were talking about tightly controlled hospital settings, short exposures, people monitored by nurses who locked the medication cart. But as the years passed, that modest note was retold, simplified, then weaponized. Purdue and friendly pain specialists began treating the letter as if it were a towering study. A single hospital snapshot became evidence that chronic opioid therapy in the community carried minimal risk. Sales reps cited it in living rooms, in break rooms, in crowded hotel ballrooms, where doctors earned continuing education credits. Because of this one flimsy data point, skeptical physicians could be reassured, their anxiety smoothed over with a number that sounded precise, modern, scientific. A complex, uncertain risk was flattened into a comforting talking point. Addiction, with all its messy roots in biology, trauma, poverty, and power, was squeezed into a neat percentage that fit perfectly into a sales script. His story is one of how a family's hunger for money can turn doubt into design and nuance into noise. It's an example of what happens when marketing gets to define reality faster than science can correct it. Pattern interrupt for a moment. If one misleading statistic, born from a 5-sentence letter, can reshape national prescribing habits, what does that say about how evidence is consumed today? About how easily charts, headlines, and expert quotes can be marshaled to serve whoever has the most to gain? Because that less than 1% claim did not stay in journals. It moved into exam rooms, pharmacies, and finally into homes, setting the stage for the next phase of Purdue's campaign, turning reassured doctors into high-volume customers. That tiny statistic had done its job. Doctors were calm, patients were hopeful. And inside Purdue's offices, that calm wasn't the end goal. It was the launch pad for an empire. There was a time when Purdue was a modest, family-owned company selling cough syrups and laxatives. Under the Sacklers, it turned into something else. A high-pressure marketing machine where the real product wasn't just a pill, it was a story. So let me take you back to the late 1990s, when that story was being drilled into an army of sales reps who were about to fan out across America. Purdue didn't just hire more reps, it multiplied them. From a few dozen to hundreds, then over 1,000, each one carefully trained not only in dosage charts and pharmacology, but in emotional theater. They were taught to talk about life, not chemistry. To describe the grandfather who could finally play with his grandkids, the mother who could finally work again, the blue-collar worker who stayed on the job instead of sliding into poverty. Pain was the villain. OxyContin was the redemption arc. The scripts were polished, almost devotional. Reps were instructed to emphasize less than 1% addiction risk, to repeat that OxyContin's time-release formula made it safer, to frame it as a moral duty. Good doctors relieve suffering. Great doctors don't let fear of addiction keep patients in pain. Because of this framing, any hesitation from a physician wasn't just a medical concern, it sounded like a failure of compassion. Inside training sessions, the language became even more ruthless. Role-playing exercises taught reps to overcome objections about addiction. If a doctor mentioned patients coming back early, asking for higher doses, the rep was coached to interpret that not as a red flag, but as tolerance and undertreated pain. The solution was rarely to question the drug. The solution was often to increase the dose. Behind the emotional stories and moral appeals, another system was running quietly: data. Purdue's internal documents later revealed spreadsheets tracking high-prescribing doctors with almost obsessive detail. Those who wrote large volumes of opioid prescriptions were flagged, ranked, and visited again and again. More samples, more lunches, more educational dinners in nice restaurants, where the line between science and sales blurred along with the wine. One former rep described being handed a list of targets and told, in effect, this is where the money is. General practitioners in small towns, pain clinics with packed waiting rooms, doctors already comfortable with opioids. The message was clear: focus on the whales. If a physician pushed back about addiction, the rep's script was ready. If that same physician started escalating doses rapidly, that wasn't a warning sign, it was an opportunity. And in some communities, those opportunities turned into something else entirely. Prescription counts didn't just climb, they spiked. Pharmacies in tiny towns were ordering more OxyContin than big city hospitals. Waiting rooms filled, word spread, and what followed would look less like medicine and more like a gold rush. Those gold rush towns didn't appear by accident. They were fed one conference badge and one glossy binder at a time. There was a time when pain management suddenly went from a quiet corner of medicine to the center of the stage. From 1996 to 2002, Purdue poured money into more than 20,000 so-called educational events, flying in over 100,000 doctors, nurses, and pharmacists. Not only was that an unprecedented campaign in pain medicine, it turned education into a national touring show with OxyContin as the unspoken headliner. Let me take you back to one of those weekends. A resort hotel, not a hospital auditorium. Palm trees, golf courses, a spa down the hall. Inside the ballroom, the lights are low, the projector is bright, and the podium is occupied by a polished pain expert, flown in from a major university. The slides are sleek, the language is soothing, and the message repeats with hypnotic regularity. Opioids are underused. Long-acting opioids are safer. Addiction in patients is rare when the drug is prescribed. Dinner is covered. Travel is covered. The honoraria for speakers are generous. It feels less like a medical seminar and more like a shareholders' meeting in a rising empire of pain relief. And because the invitations arrive with official-sounding logos and continuing medical education credits, it all looks respectable, even noble. This is how medicine keeps up with the science, right? Except the money behind the curtain kept flowing in one direction. Professional pain societies that issued guidelines, CME providers that wrote the curricula, and key opinion leaders whose names carried weight in every clinic were all financially entangled with Purdue. Grants, sponsorships, consulting fees, naming rights. It was a web of relationships that made one company's talking points sound like objective truth. When a respected society declared it unethical to leave chronic pain untreated, the subtext in many hotel ballrooms was simple: unethical not to prescribe more. Because of this relentless messaging, a cultural norm flipped. What had once been a cautious last resort for cancer or post-surgical agony became, almost overnight, the progressive and compassionate choice for back pain, arthritis, migraines, even vague long-term discomfort. To prescribe a powerful long-acting opioid was framed as modern, humane, scientific. To hesitate was painted as cruel, old-fashioned, even ignorant. Now pattern interrupt. Step out of the ballroom. Imagine a small-town clinic on a Tuesday morning. No chandeliers, no buffet, just plastic chairs and a line of patients who know the doctor by first name. The same phrases from the conference: low risk of addiction, around-the-clock control, improved quality of life, start showing up in 10-minute visits. A factory worker with a bad back, a grandmother with joint pain, a teenager injured in sports. They all walk out with the same new prescription that once glowed on a slide in a distant resort. It's an example of what happens when marketing colonizes language and then rides that language straight into everyday life. Those conferences ended on Sundays. The bar tabs closed, the projectors dimmed. But the new habits they created kept spreading, one refill at a time, until the line between compassionate care and chemical dependence would shatter completely in the next phase of this story. Let me take you back to a town that never made headlines, because in this story, the most important disasters were quiet. Call it Millstone, an old Rust Belt city pressed up against a river and a set of railroad tracks, where there was a time when the factory's steam whistles told everyone when to wake up, when to eat, when to sleep. Then the whistles stopped. The glass plant closed, the mine cut shifts, the auto parts factory moved south. Men and women who had spent a life lifting, hauling, bending, twisting, walked away with severance checks, wrecked backs, bad knees, and mortgages they could no longer quite afford. Physical pain blended with economic poverty until they felt like the same thing. Into that vacuum came the new language of pain management. Purdue's sales reps drove into town in rental sedans, walked into dingy clinics with glossy charts, and promised a future where no one had to suffer needlessly. Local doctors, already overwhelmed and underpaid, were reassured that OxyContin was different, that the risk of addiction was less than 1%, that a 12-hour pill would finally give their patients their lives back. The pitch landed. Prescriptions spiked. Pharmacies that once mostly filled blood pressure meds and antibiotics started moving orange bottles of 10s, then 20s, then 40s. Patients who had never imagined taking a powerful opioid were told it was safe, modern, even humane. It sounded like progress. It sounded like wealth and power finally trickling down in the form of relief. At first, it worked. The former steelworker could sleep through the night. The single mother with a slip disc could mop the diner floor again. Pain scores dropped, refills were routine, and the town's doctors were praised for being up to date. But Oxy's clock was already ticking. Those 12 hours shrank to 8, then 6. People woke up sweating, aching, angry. The answer, they were told, was not dependence, just breakthrough pain that required a higher dose. His story is one of millions. A man starts on 20 milligrams after workplace injury, moves to 40 when the relief fades, then 80 when the withdrawals begin to whisper. When the prescriptions run out, he starts doctor shopping, driving to the next county, then the next state, chasing signatures and stamps. Around him, a quiet black market blooms, pill bottles traded behind gas stations, in parking lots, at family barbecues. The town changes, pawn shops thrive, as wedding rings, guitars, and power tools flow across the counter to cover one more script. Workplaces struggle to keep shifts staffed. Supervisors learn to spot the glassy eyes and the long bathroom breaks. Grandparents who thought their hard years were finally over find themselves raising toddlers while their own children cycle through rehabs, jails, and too often funerals. It's an example of what happens when a corporate empire treats human vulnerability as a growth market. Millstone is fictional, but everything about it is real, repeated from Appalachia to the Midwest, from coal towns to coastal suburbs. And if one forgotten town could drown in prescriptions written with such ruthless precision, how many others were following the same script, drafted in a distant boardroom and paid for with family photos on pawnshop shelves? There was a time when a doctor's office meant a quiet waiting room, old magazines, and a blood pressure cuff. In the new opioid empire, some of those offices morphed into something closer to a drive-thru. Same white coats, same diplomas on the wall, very different business model. Let me take you back to the rise of the pill mill. On paper, these were pain clinics. In practice, they were factories. Patients in and out in minutes, cursory exams, if any, and nearly everyone walking away with high-dose opioid prescriptions. Many were cash only, no insurance, no questions, no trail. They clustered along highways in Appalachia, Florida, and the Midwest, turning strip malls and cinder block buildings into hubs of chemical wealth and quiet ruin. Outside the most notorious clinics, the scenes were impossible to miss. Parking lots jammed at 8 a.m., long lines that wrapped around the building, license plates from 3, 4, 5 states away. Local residents joked that these places had better tourism numbers than the state park. Dry humor aside, pharmacies down the street were drowning in scripts, filling so many OxyContin prescriptions that they ran out of stock by noon. Inside Purdue's headquarters, this chaos did not look random. It looked like data. The company's internal documents, later unearthed in lawsuits, showed detailed tracking of high-prescribing doctors. Sales reps carried printouts and laptop dashboards ranking physicians by volume, dosage, and refill rates. The top prescribers were labeled with friendly names like Supercore or Gold Accounts, as if they were frequent flyers, not red flags. Some of those names belonged to doctors whose prescribing patterns were blindingly obvious warnings. One small-town physician writing thousands of opioid prescriptions a month. Another who almost never tried non-opioid treatments. Clinics where nearly every patient somehow needed the highest strength pills. Yet instead of asking why, Purdue often sent more sales reps, more free lunches, more speaker fees. High numbers meant opportunity, not investigation. Purdue would later insist it could not police every doctor in America, that it was up to regulators and medical boards to spot criminal behavior. Technically, that was true, but the company built a sales machine that showered rewards on exactly the kind of volume pill mills produced. Bonuses, trips, promotions, all tied to prescription growth. Because of that ruthless incentive structure, the more a doctor behaved like a dealer, the more valuable that doctor became to the empire. For the people in line outside those clinics, this was sold as medicine, not vice. A bottle with their name printed neatly on the label. A pill blessed by the FDA. It felt safer than anything from a street corner. Yet, as those bottles multiplied, something else began to move in the shadows. Pharmacies started tightening up. Doctors lost licenses. Supplies got cut. And when that legal stream finally narrowed, the cravings did not. What came next would not arrive in an orange bottle at all, and it would make OxyContin look almost gentle. What came next was cheaper, dirtier, and far deadlier. It did not arrive from a pharmacist in a white coat, but from a stranger in a parking lot, a back alley, a friend of a friend who knew a guy. The empire of the pill was about to give way to the empire of the needle. There was a time when one OxyContin could be bought on the street for a few dollars. Then the crackdown came. Prescriptions were cut, pill mills raided, doctor shopping flagged in new databases. Overnight, that same pill could cost $40, $50, even $80. Heroin, by comparison, was ruthless in its simplicity. $10 for a bag that hit harder and lasted longer. The math was brutal. When dependence ruled a life, money followed the cheapest path to relief. Let me take you back to a very different scene than a drug rep's lunch or a hospital conference room. A parked car behind a strip mall. Windows fogged. A man in his 30s, once a high school pitcher with a scholarship, now tying off his arm with a shoelace. His story is one of slow descent. It began with a prescription after a shoulder surgery, a few refills to manage breakthrough pain, then early refills, then buying extra pills from coworkers. Years later, the same brain that trusted a doctor's pen is chasing a powder in a folded wax bag, because without it, the shaking, vomiting, and bone-deep pain feel unbearable. Public health maps would later show this invisible line in shocking color. Counties that had been flooded with OxyContin in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Appalachia, parts of Ohio, West Virginia, New England mill towns, began lighting up again a decade later, this time with heroin overdoses. The names of the drugs changed, but the geography did not. It was the same families, the same neighborhoods, the same communities that had been trained to see opioids as medicine now facing a wave of street deaths. Then came another twist. In 2010, under pressure, Purdue reformulated OxyContin to make it harder to crush, snort, or inject. On paper, a triumph of safety. In practice, a cruel pivot point. Dependent users who had been breaking, chewing, or injecting the old pills found the new version turned to gel, refusing to dissolve. The craving did not reformulate. Heroin dealers, watching this change like shrewd businessmen, moved in with a clear pitch. If the pill no longer works, this will. Bathroom light. Yellow, buzzing. A person staring at their reflection. An orange bottle on the counter. A burned spoon by the sink. One hand still remembers opening child-proof caps, counting out doses. The other hand, now, guides a syringe. It is an example of what happens when a safe painkiller collides with dependence, when supply tightens but demand only grows more desperate. The line from prescription pad to needle is not theoretical. It is written in veins. And just when communities began to understand heroin, something even more lethal stepped onto the stage. Heroin was the warning siren. Fentanyl was the explosion. But inside Purdue's offices, long before most families knew the word opioid, the alarm bells were already ringing. Let me take you back to the late 1990s, when OxyContin sales were rocketing from tens of millions to over $1 billion a year. Publicly, executives spoke the language of compassion and caution. Privately, their own emails and memos told a different story, one at times inspiring and at times chilling in its cold focus on money and market share. There was a time when the company line was simple, addiction was rare, less than 1%, and abuse was mostly a misunderstanding. Yet inside Purdue, staff were tracking reports that made that claim look fragile. Sales reps wrote in about patients crushing pills, about pharmacies hit by waves of forged prescriptions, about small towns where OxyScript suddenly dwarfed every other drug. Spreadsheets flagged outlier doctors whose prescribing was so extreme it barely looked real. Those outliers were not quietly cut off. They were profiled, ranked, targeted. Internal documents later revealed that Purdue built lists of high-prescribing physicians, including clinics that law enforcement would eventually label pill mills. Instead of seeing those numbers as a red light, some executives saw an opportunity to, in their words, turbocharge sales. The language was blunt: focus on the heavy writers, push higher doses, protect the franchise. Because of this ruthless logic, even direct warnings struggled to gain traction. Field staff and medical liaisons raised concerns about addiction, about patients escalating too fast, about entire communities drowning in pills. Memos summarized growing diversion, emergency room spikes, pharmacy robberies. The response was not to rethink the empire, but to tweak the pitch. Emphasize that abuse came from a tiny minority. Blame drug seekers. Promote new talking points on pseudo-addiction, a concept that conveniently turned signs of dependence into a reason to prescribe more. These same documents would finally resurface in a different setting: courtrooms. State attorneys, general and federal prosecutors subpoenaed emails, sales call notes, marketing plans. Jurors and judges read phrases about defending the OxyContin business, about pushing into new territories, about maximizing titration to higher strengths, all while overdose deaths mounted. It's an example of what happens when a company knows far more than it admits and chooses silence over sacrifice. Because of those files, the public story of a misunderstood medicine collapsed. The paper trail showed knowledge, deliberation, and a pattern of decisions that favored revenue over risk. By the mid-2000s, the damage was undeniable. The death counts no longer invisible columns in state reports, but headlines and grieving families on the evening news. And somewhere else in Washington, far from the pharmacy counters and funeral homes, federal prosecutors were quietly assembling a case. The question was no longer whether Purdue would be charged, but how hard the government would really dare to hit a company with this much power. In May 2007, that quiet work in Washington finally exploded into public view. Purdue Pharma, the company that had turned OxyContin into a billion-dollar empire, walked into a federal courtroom in Virginia and admitted, on paper at least, that its miracle pain pill had been sold on a lie. The case was simple, and at the same time, devastating. Prosecutors laid out how for years, Purdue's marketing machine had misbranded OxyContin, telling doctors it was less addictive, less prone to abuse, and safer than older opioids, even as internal data and mounting reports told a far darker story. There was a time when glossy brochures and sales reps promised less than 1% addiction risk, while in small towns from Appalachia to New England, families were already burying their dead. So the company itself pled guilty to a felony count of misbranding a drug with intent to defraud and mislead. 3 of its top executives, the president, the chief legal officer, and the former chief medical officer, pled guilty to misdemeanors, admitting they had misled the public about OxyContin's dangers. Not only had they downplayed addiction, they had actively promoted the pill as a safer option, pushing higher doses, longer use, and a vision of pain-free life that, at times inspiring and at times chilling, blurred into outright deception. On paper, the penalties sounded huge. Purdue agreed to pay more than $600 million in fines and settlements, one of the largest pharmaceutical penalties in U.S. history at the time. The executives paid their own fines, lost their positions, and carried misdemeanor convictions. But there were no felony charges for them, no prison time, no one in handcuffs doing the walk past cameras that so many grieving parents had imagined while standing over hospital beds and funeral caskets. Because of that gap between the scale of harm and the softness of the punishment, the reaction was fierce. The U.S. attorney called it a landmark, a warning shot to the industry. Yet many prosecutors on the team reportedly pushed for harsher charges and walked away frustrated. Victims' families spoke at the hearing, describing lives shattered by addiction, careers lost, children taken, wealth drained into rehabs and funerals, and they asked how a misdemeanor could possibly match that kind of ruin. Public health experts were just as blunt. To them, this was not just a story about one company. It was an example of what happens when a corporation can mislead doctors, flood communities, rake in money, and then treat a massive fine as a cost of doing business. Let me take you back to that number. By 2007, OxyContin had already generated billions. A $600 million penalty hurt, but it did not break the empire. So here is the uncomfortable question. If this is what accountability looks like for a company tied to a national epidemic, what message does that send to every other boardroom watching from the sidelines? Because in the years after the plea, prescriptions stayed high, overdose deaths climbed, and other opioid makers took careful notes. And while Purdue stood in that courtroom saying guilty, behind the scenes, its owners were already working on a different strategy, one that would protect their family name and their wealth, even as the crisis deepened. Publicly, the message was simple: lesson learned, case closed. Privately, the money kept flowing. After the 2007 guilty plea, there was a time when you might expect OxyContin to fade into the background, a tainted brand limping toward retirement. Instead, Purdue's empire of pain pills kept expanding. In 2006, OxyContin sales were already bringing in hundreds of millions per year. Within a few years of the plea, annual revenues would climb toward the billion-dollar mark again, and prescriptions for high-dose opioids across the industry stayed stubbornly high. The scandal had dented the logo. It had not dented the business model. Purdue's leaders understood something very clearly. Because the company had pleaded guilty, they could now frame the crisis as history. In press releases and interviews, the settlement was described as a resolution of past mistakes, as if the danger lived only in old brochures and outdated talking points. The story they told regulators was one of reform and responsibility. The story they told Wall Street quietly was that demand for OxyContin remained strong, and that the market for chronic pain was far from saturated. So the sales machine did not shut down, it reloaded. Sales reps were called back into conference rooms, not to be sidelined, but to be retrained. The pitch was updated, the language softened. No more casual promises that addiction was rare. Instead, they leaned on new phrases: properly selected patients, closely monitored therapy, responsible prescribing. On paper, it sounded careful, almost cautious. In practice, the targets for prescriptions, the bonuses, the pressure to grow market share all remained very real. Then came the upgrade. Purdue rolled out a reformulated abuse deterrent version of OxyContin, designed so the pills were harder to crush or snort. Sales reps were armed with fresh brochures showing diagrams, lab tests, reassuring arrows pointing down at tampering. Let me take you back to those glossy presentations. The problem, according to the slides, was not widespread dependence, but a few bad actors who misused a good medicine. The solution was not less opioid use, but a smarter pill. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it was a masterclass in reframing risk without touching the core, long-term exposure to a highly addictive drug. Because the fines, even huge ones, could be paid from ongoing profits, the system itself sent a quiet signal. A company could plead guilty to a felony, write a check measured in hundreds of millions, and still walk away with a product that generated many times that in revenue. It's an example of what happens when legal penalties are treated less like punishment and more like a line item nestled between marketing and research on a spreadsheet. Meanwhile, outside those boardrooms, real life was changing. Prescription opioids were driving the first wave of an epidemic, pulling families from stability into poverty, from weekend injuries into lifelong dependence. And as OxyContin and its cousins flooded American medicine cabinets, another market was quietly preparing to catch the overflow. Heroin traffickers were watching the demand curve. Fentanyl labs overseas were taking notes. The pill era was still roaring, but far away from any Purdue sales meeting, the second and third waves were already forming, just offshore, waiting to crash. Those offshore waves didn't stay offshore for long. By the early 2010s, they were crashing straight into American neighborhoods, not as prescription bottles with neat labels, but as tiny grains of powder that could stop a person's breathing in seconds. The name on this next chapter wasn't OxyContin, it was fentanyl. There was a time when fentanyl was mostly a hospital tool, a powerful anesthetic measured out by anesthesiologists and pain specialists in controlled settings. But as law enforcement finally squeezed some pill mills and tightened prescribing rules, the market didn't disappear, it mutated. Illicit labs in China and Mexico learned they could synthesize fentanyl cheaply, press it into fake oxycodone tablets, mix it into heroin, or lace it through cocaine and counterfeit Xanax, multiplying potency while cutting costs. A few grains too many in a batch, and the margin between a high and a fatal overdose vanished. Because fentanyl can be 50 times stronger than heroin and about 100 times more potent than morphine, the risk profile of the entire drug supply changed almost overnight. Users who thought they were taking the same dose they'd survived 100 times before were suddenly playing Russian roulette. Dealers advertised fire heroin. In reality, many were pushing fentanyl-laced powder that could kill in a single bag. It wasn't more glamorous, just more efficient, more ruthless. And here is where the story loops back to Purdue's empire. For nearly 2 decades, OxyContin and its cousins had trained a huge population to rely on opioids just to feel normal. Patients who started with a prescription moved to doctor shopping, then to pill mills, then to heroin when the pills got too expensive, were now walking straight into a fentanyl-saturated market. The demand had been built in doctors' offices and pharmacies. the supply had shifted to clandestine labs and cartel networks. The bridge between those worlds was human dependence. Let me take you back to an overhead view, because the scale is easy to miss up close. Imagine the map of the United States. First, a pale blue wave rolls across it in the late 1990s and 2000s. Prescription pills dominating Appalachia, parts of the Rust Belt, pockets of rural New England. Then a darker wave, heroin, spreads along old industrial corridors and city centers where pill users graduated to cheaper street options. Finally, a third wave, deep red fentanyl, doesn't just hit those same counties. It splashes into suburbs, college towns, wealthy coastal cities, native reservations, small farm communities. The geography of overdose stopped respecting familiar lines of poverty or wealth. His story is one of policy failures and personal tragedies, at times inspiring and at times chilling in how predictable it all looks in hindsight. Purdue did not cook fentanyl in a clandestine lab, did not ship bricks across borders, did not press counterfeit pills in a garage. But it did help create the largest, most vulnerable opioid-dependent population in modern American life, a population that illicit fentanyl then harvested with brutal efficiency. It's an example of what happens when a medical system, a company, and a country build demand for a dangerous drug, then lose control of who supplies it next. And the most unsettling part is this. Even as fentanyl overdoses spiked and morgues overflowed, the legal opioid machine kept humming in the background, setting the stage for yet another evolution in the crisis. Even as the overdose charts bent upward and morgues overflowed, another graph was climbing too. The number of marble walls quietly etched with one word: Sackler. There was a time when that name didn't mean opioids or lawsuits. It meant culture, prestige, old world wealth. Walk into the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and you'd pass through the Sackler wing to see the Temple of Dendur. Visit the Louvre in Paris, and you'd find the Sackler wing of Oriental antiquities. At the Tate in London, at the Guggenheim, at major universities from Yale to Oxford, the same pattern appeared. Galleries, courtyards, medical buildings, all stamped with the family name like a global brand. This was not an accident. It was a strategy. The Sacklers had turned a regional drug maker into an empire built on OxyContin, then turned those OxyContin profits into naming rights, endowments, and glittering donor plaques. Philanthropy became the soft focus lens on a very hard business. Because when money came from a controversial product, the logic was simple. Convert it into something no one wants to criticize. Art, science, education. A family could be ruthless in the marketplace, then pose as patrons of human progress. Let me take you back to the gala circuit of the 2000s. Black tie dinners under chandeliers, curators thanking the Sackler family for their generosity, museum brochures praising their commitment to the life of the mind. Meanwhile, in the background, overdose deaths rose, pill mills spread, and families slid from what stability into poverty and grief. The contrast was almost theatrical. On one side, champagne toasts in a marble atrium. On the other, a parent driving to a methadone clinic at 6 a.m., clutching a photo of the child who didn't make it. For years, the two worlds barely touched. Then activists forced them to collide. Artist Nan Goldin, herself addicted to OxyContin after a prescription, launched the group PAIN and took the protest inside the museums that bore the Sackler name. Demonstrators tossed fake prescriptions into the reflecting pool at the Met, staged die-ins at the Guggenheim, unfurled banners that read, "Shame on Sackler." It was an example of what happens when a family's carefully curated image meets a public that has finally seen the bill. Under mounting pressure, institutions began to flinch. The Tate announced it would no longer accept Sackler money. The National Portrait Gallery in London turned down a proposed donation. Then came the symbolic earthquake. Major museums started stripping the name from their walls. The Louvre removed Sackler from its signage. The Met agreed to take it down from several galleries. One by one, those letters vanished from stone and bronze. On paper, it looked like accountability. In reality, the family's wealth remained largely intact, sheltered in trusts and offshore entities, still exercising quiet power. A name could disappear in an afternoon with a screwdriver and a new plaque. The money that had put it there was much harder to dislodge. And as curators debated fonts and replacement names, another fight was already forming, far from the cameras and the gala dinners. Not in galleries, but in bankruptcy court, where the Sacklers were about to attempt their most ambitious rebranding yet. This time, they weren't just donating money. They were trying to buy a legal, clean slate. There was a time when Purdue could still pretend this was a misunderstanding, a PR problem, a few bad headlines that would eventually fade. By the late 2010s, that illusion was gone. In its place stood something far more dangerous to the empire the Sacklers had built, a wall of lawsuits rising higher every month. Let me take you back to those years when the numbers themselves told the story. Not a handful of angry plaintiffs, but thousands of cases filed by nearly every kind of local government in American life. 40+ states, counties that had lost tax bases to overdose deaths, cities paying overtime for police and EMTs, Native American tribes whose clinics and social services were collapsing under the weight of addiction. Each one had a name, a budget, a graveyard. The allegations were blunt. Purdue, they said, had pushed OxyContin with deceptive marketing, claimed addiction was rare, downplayed withdrawal, and trained sales reps to turn every complaint of pain into a chance to escalate the dose. That wasn't just fraud in their telling. It was a public nuisance on a historic scale, a man-made disaster that flooded communities with pills and left taxpayers to fund the cleanup in hospitals, jails, and foster homes. Some suits went after the money, calculating line by line what the crisis had cost. Overdose reversals, neonatal intensive care for opioid-exposed babies, long-term treatment beds that never seemed to be enough. Others aimed at something more dangerous to Purdue's power. They demanded internal documents, emails, sales manuals, risk assessments. They wanted to know what the company knew, when it knew it, and how many chances there had been to pull back before the death toll exploded. Picture a pattern interrupt here, not a courtroom drama with a single heroic attorney, but a silent storage warehouse, floor-to-ceiling metal shelves, cardboard boxes, and thick binders, each spine labeled not with legal jargon, but with town names: Huntington, Everett, Cherokee Nation, Cuyahoga County. A visual reminder that this wasn't an abstract national crisis. It was thousands of small, specific stories of family life blown apart, each one now translated into a case caption. Because of Purdue's ruthless marketing playbook and the way OxyContin profits had been siphoned into Sackler wealth, the legal theories began to multiply. Public nuisance, consumer fraud, unjust enrichment, even racketeering in some complaints. Different angles, different statutes, same core question: who should pay for what happened when a prescription pill became a gateway to heroin, fentanyl, and mass death? Strategically, it was chaos and leverage at the same time. Judges tried to bundle cases into giant federal multi-district proceedings. States fought over whether to settle early for guaranteed money or hold out for a trial that might expose more secrets. Tribes insisted on being heard separately. pointing out that the crisis had hit reservations with a ferocity that rarely made national news. It's an example of what happens when private profit collides with public catastrophe. The lawsuits were not just about clawing back money. They were an attempt to pin down accountability before it slipped away into foundations, art wings, and offshore accounts. And in the middle of that storm, Purdue and the Sacklers reached for one last tool, the strange technical power of bankruptcy law. Bankruptcy was supposed to be for broken companies, not billion-dollar damage control campaigns. Yet, in September 2019, Purdue Pharma walked into federal court and pulled a lever that would freeze thousands of lawsuits in a single move, one filing in one courtroom against a nationwide epidemic. There was a time when bankruptcy meant a business had run out of money. Purdue was different. The company was drowning in legal risk, not cash. By declaring Chapter 11, Purdue didn't just admit defeat, it tried to seize control. All those cases filed by states, cities, tribes, and families were suddenly funneled into one giant proceeding, where a judge could set a hard ceiling on how much the OxyContin empire would ever pay. On paper, that sounded efficient. In practice, it was a shield. Through bankruptcy, Purdue could transform sprawling, unpredictable jury trials into a single negotiation, with a single pot of money under rules that quietly favored speed and finality over messy public reckoning. It's an example of what happens when corporate law meets mass tragedy and discovers it can tidy the whole thing up. But the most controversial move wasn't about Purdue at all. It was about the Sackler family. They did not file for personal bankruptcy. Their art, their real estate, their offshore wealth stayed safely in their own names. Yet in the same courtroom, they asked for something extraordinary: legal releases that would block nearly all future civil lawsuits against them forever in exchange for a negotiated payout. In other words, use the company's bankruptcy to buy peace for the family. To supporters, this was pragmatic. The Sacklers would contribute billions, Purdue's assets would be repurposed, and the country would finally get money for treatment and abatement. To critics, it looked ruthless. A wealthy family that had pulled more than $10 billion out of Purdue over the years was now using a process meant for failing businesses to lock in immunity without ever opening their own books. The proposed deal had a strange dual character, at times inspiring and at times chilling. Purdue, the villain of the opioid story, would be reborn as a public benefit company. Future profits from OxyContin and other drugs would no longer flow to the Sacklers, but into trusts for addiction treatment, overdose reversal drugs, and prevention programs. States and victims would receive structured payouts funded by both Purdue's ongoing operations and the Sacklers' contributions. On paper, it sounded almost redemptive. Turn a pill that fueled an epidemic into a revenue stream for healing. In reality, many families heard a different message. If the check is big enough, the powerful can close the book on almost anything. For a moment, it seemed done. The plan won support from most states, passed through the bankruptcy court, and looked ready to lock into place. Then a simple question rose from the appeals. Can bankruptcy law really do that? And when that question finally reached the Supreme Court, the entire deal and the future of the Sackler fortune suddenly hung in the balance. At the very top of American law, the question landed with a thud. Can a family pull billions out of a company, help unleash a national epidemic, and then buy peace in bankruptcy court without ever going bankrupt themselves? Not only was the Purdue deal enormous, it was a test of how far money and power could bend the rules that were supposed to restrain them. After years of negotiation, Purdue's plan promised a new public benefit company, billions for treatment and prevention, and a sweeping shield for the Sackler family. In exchange for paying roughly $6 billion, the Sacklers would receive releases blocking nearly all current and future civil lawsuits tied to OxyContin. Most states, desperate to plug gaping holes in their health systems, signed on. The bankruptcy judge approved it. For a moment, it looked final. Then there was a time when a quieter group of holdouts refused to let it slide. The U.S. trustee, some victims, and the federal government challenged the deal, arguing that these non-debtor releases went too far. Purdue was in bankruptcy. The Sacklers were not. Yet the plan treated them as if they could slam the same door on accountability and walk away with the rest of their fortune intact. The legal issue was deceptively simple. Bankruptcy law is designed to give a fresh start to a debtor who comes in, opens the books, takes the hit. But can a court use that power to wipe away claims against outsiders, owners, executives, entire family networks, who never filed for bankruptcy at all? Or is that a leap from financial reorganization into something closer to private amnesty? Supporters of the deal said the choice was cruel but clear. Take the settlement or risk years of appeals while people keep dying. They pointed to the $6 billion on the table, the fragile treatment programs waiting for funding, the fear that without global peace the Sacklers might pay far less, much later. To them, it was a hard bargain, but a necessary one. Opponents saw something else, a dangerous template. If the Sacklers could do this, why not the owners of the next giant polluter, the next defective medical device empire, the next social media platform accused of fueling a mental health crisis? It's an example of what happens when private deals start to swallow public judgment, when efficiency quietly outruns accountability. Now, pattern interrupt. Let me take you back to an imaginary scandal 10 years from now. A company's product maims thousands. Executives deny, delay, then finally offer a pot of money on one condition: no trials, no discovery, no sworn testimony from the people who made the key decisions. Just a bankruptcy plan, a payout, and silence. Would that be justice, or just a more streamlined way for the wealthy to close the book on almost anything? The Supreme Court showdown over Purdue wasn't only about one pill. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it was a preview of how far the law will let billionaires go to manage their own reckoning, and what price society is willing to pay for speed. But outside the Supreme Court's marble halls, the ledger looks very different. Between 1999 and 2019, nearly 247,000 people in the United States died from prescription opioid overdoses. Not only is that a number on a page, it is an entire city erased, an invisible empire of absence. In the early years, OxyContin was at the center of it, driving prescribing habits, flooding small towns, and turning routine injuries into entry points for addiction. There was a time when a 40-milligram tablet was marketed like a minor miracle. For many families, it became the first domino. Let me take you back to a quiet kitchen in Ohio. A high school football coach, early 40s, tears his rotator cuff, gets a prescription for OxyContin because he is told addiction is rare and the pain must be controlled. At first, he follows the bottle. Then the pills run out, the pain and cravings do not, and he starts borrowing from friends. 2 years later, his wife is explaining to their kids why dad is in rehab instead of at the game. His story is one of hard work, loyalty, and then a spiral that no one thought could touch a middle-class life. Because of this wave of dependence and overdose, the ripples spread far beyond morgues and crime reports. Child welfare workers watched caseloads explode as parents overdosed, disappeared into jail, or cycled through treatment. In some counties, more than half of foster care entries were tied to parental drug use, a quiet generation of children raised by grandparents strangers, or no one stable at all. Homeless shelters filled with people who had lost jobs, savings, and finally housing as prescriptions turned into street pills, then heroin, then fentanyl. Emergency rooms became the front line. Nurses learned to recognize the gray, barely breathing bodies of overdose within seconds. Rural hospitals, already hanging on by a financial thread, spent nights reversing overdoses with naloxone, stabilizing patients, and then discharging them back into the same towns, the same prescribers, the same pain. It's an example of what happens when money, marketing, and medicine align without anyone truly in charge of the human bill that comes due. On Purdue's side of the ledger, the numbers were clean. Sales charts climbed from tens of millions in the mid-1990s to over $1 billion a year by 2000, smooth curves on glossy slides. Later, legal settlements added their own precise figures. $600 million here, billions proposed there, all neatly rounded, all payable over time. On the ground, nothing about this was neat. Grief did not follow quarterly reports. Relapse did not wait for a judge's order. And yet, amid all this devastation, another quieter battle was taking shape. Not just over how much money would change hands, but over the story itself, what really happened, who truly held the power, and who would finally be blamed when the history of this epidemic is written. The battle over the story did not happen by accident. It was convenient. Because there was a time when the explanation for this epidemic could be wrapped up in a single comfortable phrase: bad choices. In that version of the story, addiction lives inside individual weakness. A teenager who should have known better. A worker who couldn't handle their prescription. A parent who threw their life away. The focus stays on willpower, on self-control, on moral failure. If people had just said no, the thinking goes, none of this would have happened. It feels tidy. It keeps the rest of society, and especially the people with money and power, at a safe distance. But let me take you back to the boardrooms and marketing meetings where another story was being written. Purdue did not build a multi-billion-dollar empire by waiting for random, weak-willed patients to appear. It went looking for them. It mapped out regions of chronic pain and economic poverty, trained sales reps to flatter overworked doctors, and flooded clinics with free samples and glossy brochures, claiming addiction risk was less than 1%. Not only did the company push OxyContin as safe, it did so while tracking which doctors prescribed the most and rewarding them with more visits, more dinners, more attention. This was not neutral education, it was a campaign. From 1996 to 2002, Purdue funded tens of thousands of educational events, paying for conferences, speakers, and pain courses that looked scientific but repeated the same talking points. Long-term opioids are underused. Dependence is rare. Patients are suffering needlessly. Because of these efforts, marketing began to wear a lab coat. Sales pitches walked in through the front door as continuing medical education. Regulators were supposed to be the counterweight. Yet thinly staffed agencies, revolving doors between industry and oversight, and an over-reliance on company-provided data created gaps wide enough for a blockbuster drug to slip through. An FDA-approved label suggesting delayed absorption, reduced abuse risk gave OxyContin a halo, even as internal documents and early reports showed people crushing, snorting, and injecting the pills. Oversight moved slowly, sales moved fast. So here is the central question. When a product is engineered for long, powerful effect, promoted as low risk on shaky evidence, and then saturated into vulnerable communities with bonuses tied to dose and volume, where does responsibility really lie? On the patient who followed the prescription, or on the corporate machine that designed the entire environment around predictable dependence? Pattern interrupt. Take the story so far and replay it in your head. Everywhere the word addict appears, swap in customer. Everywhere you hear dealer, replace it with sales rep. The pill mill becomes a high prescribing clinic. The street corner becomes a territory. Suddenly, the language changes, but the behavior does not. It is an example of what happens when the same actions, driven by the same hunger for wealth and market share, are condemned at the bottom and celebrated at the top. And the next part of this story will show how long it took for that double standard to finally face a reckoning. That double standard didn't appear out of nowhere. It was built, endorsed, and stamped scientific by the very institutions meant to protect the public. There was a time when a green light from regulators and a citation in a medical journal felt like an ironclad guarantee. In the OxyContin era, those guarantees turned out to be alarmingly negotiable. Let me take you back to the mid-1990s, when Purdue brought its new pill to the Food and Drug Administration. On paper, the FDA looked powerful. It could block a drug, demand more trials, force warnings. In reality, it was outgunned. A small team of reviewers, drowning in applications, depended heavily on company data, company analyses, company narratives. When Purdue said its slow-release coating would make OxyContin less addictive, regulators were largely reading from Purdue's script. Because the agency lacked the money, manpower, and time to independently verify every claim, it became vulnerable to what wasn't in the files. Long-term addiction outcomes, real-world misuse, communities already struggling with poverty and unemployment. Those gaps weren't accidents. They were blind spots that a ruthless marketing empire could drive a billion-dollar truck through. Medical journals added another layer of authority. A brief 1980 letter in the New England Journal of Medicine claiming addiction in hospitalized patients treated with opioids was rare, was not a robust clinical trial. It was a tiny observation, yet Purdue and others waved it around like holy scripture. Industry-funded studies, often short, narrow, and framed to highlight benefits, sailed into print. Once published, they were cited in sales pitches, at conferences, and in glossy brochures as if they were unassailable truth. Professional societies joined the chorus. Pain societies and specialty groups accepted pharma money for conferences, educational events, even guideline development. From 1996 to 2002, Purdue alone funded more than 20,000 pain management programs, reaching over 100,000 clinicians. The message was consistent. Pain was undertreated. Opioids were humane. Addiction was rare. It was an example of what happens when financial dependence quietly bends scientific judgment, while everyone insists the science is still pure. This is regulatory capture in real time. Agencies meant to police an industry become reliant on its fees, its data, its revolving door talent. Journals depend on reprint orders and advertising. Societies lean on sponsorships to keep the lights on. Over years, the watchdog stops looking like an enemy and starts looking like a partner. The language softens, the scrutiny dulls, and the public never sees the shift. His story is one of agencies, journals, and societies that did not wake up fast enough. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the life of a miracle drug shows how easily power can dress itself up as protection. And if the watchdogs were compromised or simply outmatched, who, if anyone, was really left to shield families from the next miracle? The answer would not come from the top of the system, but from the cracks forming underneath it. If power could dress itself up as protection, Purdue's marketing team would be its tailor. They didn't just sell OxyContin, they sold a story about pain, about mercy, about what a modern, humane empire of medicine ought to look like. The playbook started with a simple move: find a universal human problem. There was a time when pain was treated as an unfortunate side effect of life, something to be endured rather than eliminated. Purdue helped rewrite that. Pain was reframed as a vast, silent epidemic, dramatically undertreated, a moral failure of the medical system. If people were suffering, the story went, it was not fate, it was neglect. Once the wound was opened, the cure was ready. OxyContin was positioned as the enlightened solution, a long-acting, sophisticated pill that promised relief without the old-school dangers. Not only was it presented as effective, it was presented as safer, less addictive, more scientific. This wasn't just another drug, it was progress, and saying no began to sound cruel. To make that message stick, Purdue needed translators inside the profession. So they went after key opinion leaders, the respected doctors whose names carried weight in conferences and journals. These physicians were paid to give educational talks, flown to resorts, featured in glossy materials. They stood on podiums, cited reassuring data, and told their peers that fear of addiction was outdated. Money flowed, prestige followed, and the line between marketing and medicine quietly dissolved. Behind those podiums, the numbers were being massaged. Purdue highlighted a claim that addiction occurred in less than 1% of patients, a figure traced back to a brief letter, not a rigorous trial. Favorable studies were amplified. Inconvenient findings about abuse and withdrawal were minimized, delayed, or buried in technical language. Because of this selective vision, OxyContin could be sold as revolutionary, while early warning signs were treated as noise. Then came the faces. Slick brochures and training videos featured patients who could finally play with their children, go back to work, reclaim their lives. Emotional narratives did what spreadsheets could not. They made hesitation feel heartless. If someone raised concerns about long-term dependence, there was always a smiling testimonial ready to answer, at times inspiring and at times chilling in its simplicity. Now let me take you back to the present. Look at vaping companies promising a cleaner alternative, weight loss drugs marketed as empowerment, social media platforms talking about connection while tracking every click. The pattern repeats. Identify a deep human ache, declare it scandalously undertreated, unveil a modern fix, recruit experts, polish the data, flood the zone with stories of liberation. It's an example of what happens when a marketing playbook learns to speak the language of compassion. The question is not whether this script will appear again, but where and how quickly it will be believed. Inside Purdue, that script of compassion had a very specific stage direction: win. Not gently, not respectfully. Win like this was war. There was a time when sales meetings didn't sound like healthcare conferences at all. They sounded like military briefings. Maps of the United States went up on projector screens, carved into territories. Doctors became targets. Quarterly pushes turned into campaigns. The language was deliberate. Market share wasn't a goal. It was a battlefield to be conquered, an empire of prescriptions that had to expand or die. Let me take you back to a typical regional meeting in the late 1990s. Reps packed into hotel ballrooms, music blaring, hype videos rolling. Charts flashed red and green like a radar screen. Managers barked out numbers, pointed to lagging areas, circled zip codes where OxyContin penetration was underdeveloped. The message was simple: there are lives out there in pain, but on this stage, the real measure was territory not yet captured. Because of that framing, the sales force was trained less like educators and more like combat units. Every rep had a bag of tactics: free lunches, educational dinners, glossy brochures, and a rehearsed pitch about a supposedly low addiction risk. Their mission was clear: increase scripts, drive conversions, and, whenever possible, move patients to higher doses. The higher the dose, the higher the revenue. The higher the revenue, the closer the bonus. Money sharpened the focus. Purdue tied bonuses directly to prescription volume and dose escalation. Hit a target, get a check, crush it, win a luxury vacation, a Rolex, a plaque, public praise on the big screen. Some reps started calling OxyContin OxyBonus with a smile that was only half a joke. When a 40 milligram prescription turned into an 80, that wasn't a red flag, it was a cause for celebration. Inside this world, human complexity was flattened into metrics. Patients in chronic pain, workers injured on the job, teenagers with dental surgery, all of them collapsed into scripts. A hesitant physician became an opportunity. A doctor who prescribed heavily was a high-value prescriber, or a whale account. Entire lives with family histories, trauma, poverty, and fragile recovery were summarized in a line on a spreadsheet. That language created distance. When a rep talked about a clinic doing great volume, there was no need to picture the waiting room, the hollow-eyed patients, the parents counting pills at the kitchen table. Doctors were accounts. Communities were markets. Moral discomfort doesn't hit as hard when the casualties show up as a dip in quarterly growth instead of a funeral. His story is one of wealth and power, but this corporate story is at times inspiring and at times chilling in a different way. It shows how ordinary people can learn to treat a drug epidemic like a sales contest, and it's an example of what happens when the war for market share runs too long. Because eventually, that war spilled out of the sales charts and into courtrooms, legislatures, and living rooms, and by the time the first subpoenas landed, something far darker than a quarterly loss was already locked in. There was a time when almost no one outside of medicine had heard the name Purdue Pharma. No protests, no headlines, no late-night monologues. Just a quiet company with a very loud sales force. The bodies were piling up long before the stories were. That changed when reporters started doing what regulators hadn't. In the early 2000s, journalists at small papers in Appalachia began noticing the same detail in obituary after obituary: OxyContin. Then larger outlets moved in: the Lexington Herald-Leader, the Roanoke Times, and later the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times dug into court filings, leaked emails, and internal sales memos that showed Purdue tracking high-prescribing doctors, rewarding them, and looking away when those clinics turned into pill mills. Let me take you back to 2003, when a tiny paper in eastern Kentucky ran a series asking why one rural county was drowning in opioid prescriptions. Local reporters interviewed families who had lost 3-4 relatives to overdoses, while a single doctor wrote thousands of OxyContin scripts a month. Their work was raw, underfunded, and years ahead of national TV. Because of that early, relentless coverage, state attorneys general and federal prosecutors finally had a public record to point to, not just grieving parents in private. As lawsuits mounted, authors turned the data into narrative. Books like Painkiller, Dreamland, and later Empire of Pain took confidential Purdue marketing plans and paired them with the life of a coal miner who crushed his back, a high school athlete who tore a ligament, a suburban mother who trusted her doctor. Statistics about 247,000 prescription opioid deaths became faces, bedrooms, empty chairs at Thanksgiving. Documentaries and streaming series followed, at times inspiring and at times chilling, walking viewers through the Sackler family's Art Wing donations on one side and county morgues on the other. Purdue and the Sacklers did not stay silent. They hired crisis PR firms, issued statements of sympathy, and insisted that addiction was a tragic misuse of a valuable medicine. They emphasized heroin, fentanyl, and drug-abusing patients, arguing that the real villains were bad doctors, rogue pharmacies, and a broken healthcare system. Museum wings were renamed, but press releases stressed that the family had acted ethically and that their wealth came from helping people in pain. So the battle for the narrative hardened. Was this the story of a few ruthless executives in one pill? Or of an empire of profit built on a healthcare system that rewarded overprescribing? Some experts framed it as a tragic misunderstanding of pain science, others as fraud, plain and simple. The answer mattered because it shaped who paid: one company, an entire industry, or a culture that demanded a quick fix for every ache. Here's the pattern interrupt. How was your own understanding built? Through a shocking headline, a prestige drama, a documentary, or a funeral in your own family. And what's still missing from that story? The quiet boardroom emails, the regulators who looked away, or the next pill waiting in the pipeline. Because the way this crisis is remembered will decide how the next one begins. But if the story stops with Purdue, it lets a whole cast of characters slip quietly off stage. There was a time when OxyContin looked like the main villain, the one pill that hijacked an entire country. Then the documents started piling up and a different picture emerged. Not a lone predator, but an ecosystem that treated pain as a growth market. Let me take you back to the late 1990s and early 2000s. Purdue's sales were exploding, but competitors were watching those numbers with a very particular kind of envy. Johnson & Johnson supplied the raw narcotic for others, while companies like Janssen pushed fentanyl patches, and Endo promoted Opana. They funded pain societies, sponsored glossy education for doctors, and repeated the same soothing phrases about safety and quality of life. Not only were they selling pills, they were selling a new vision of medical care, where long-term opioid use was not desperation, but good practice. Because Purdue's model worked so well, others copied the playbook. They downplayed addiction, highlighted compassionate relief, and flooded conferences with free meals, paid speakers, and quiet reminders that pain was the fifth vital sign. When one brand drew too much heat, another formulation stepped in, promising to be tamper-resistant, abuse-deterrent, or simply more convenient. His story is one of a pill, but this chapter is one of an industry. Behind the brand names, another empire was rising, the wholesale distributors. McKesson, Amerisource, Bergen, Cardinal Health. These companies didn't write prescriptions. They moved product, shipping crates of pills from manufacturers to pharmacies. In theory, they were gatekeepers, required to flag suspicious orders. In practice, they sent millions of tablets into tiny towns where the math made no sense. One pharmacy in Kermit, West Virginia, population under 400, received close to 9 million pills in a few years. The red flag wasn't missed, it was monetized. And at the retail end, money kept flowing. National pharmacy chains filled those prescriptions at industrial scale, sometimes rewarding high-volume stores, sometimes pressuring pharmacists who asked too many questions. Pharmacy benefit managers, the shadowy middlemen of American healthcare, negotiated rebates and formularies that made certain opioids cheaper and easier to get than safer alternatives. Because the system paid on volume, the winners were whoever could move the most pills, not whoever could protect the most lives. So yes, Purdue was ruthless, and the Sackler family will forever be linked with this crisis. but focusing only on them is comforting. It suggests one bad company, one bad product, one neat villain to blame. It's an example of what happens when a complex machine is reduced to a single face. The harder truth is that many powerful institutions did the same moral math and reached the same profitable answer. If the rules reward volume, speed, and plausible deniability, what would it actually take to stop the next wave before it starts, instead of punishing the last one after the damage is done? That question leads into a darker place. Not who failed, but how the game itself is played. Once the game itself was exposed, the referees tried to change the rules, not just with angry speeches or symbolic hearings, but with new systems, new guidelines, and new lawsuits aimed at clawing back power from an empire of pills that had already soaked into American life. There was a time when a patient could drive from doctor to doctor, collect overlapping opioid prescriptions, and no one in authority would see the full picture. Pharmacies only saw their own counter. Insurers only saw their own claims. The result was predictable. Pill mills flourished, money flowed, and overdose deaths climbed. To plug that hole, states began rolling out prescription drug monitoring programs, or PDMPs, databases that tracked controlled substance prescriptions in near real time. On paper, it sounded ruthless and efficient. Doctors could check a patient's history before refilling another high-dose OxyContin script. Pharmacists could flag suspicious patterns. Regulators could finally see which clinics were churning out thousands of opioid prescriptions a month. By the late 2010s, nearly every state had a PDMP, many of them mandatory. The faucet was tightening. But remember, the demand for relief, for escape, for a way out of pain did not disappear just because the spreadsheet changed. At the same time, a different kind of rulebook was being rewritten. In 2016, the CDC released new guidelines urging far more cautious opioid prescribing for chronic pain. Start with the lowest effective dose. Avoid long-term opioids whenever possible. Prefer physical therapy, non-opioid medications, counseling. It was a direct challenge to the old narrative that pain was the fifth vital sign, and that long-term opioids were a compassionate, low-risk answer. For many doctors, it was like waking up to find the map of acceptable practice flipped overnight. Some states went further and decided that if companies had built fortunes on this crisis, those fortunes should help pay to clean it up. Attorneys general sued not just Purdue, but other manufacturers and the giant distributors that had flooded towns with more pills than people. The settlements ran into the billions, earmarked for treatment centers, overdose reversal drugs, and prevention programs. It sounded finally like accountability. But here is the pattern interrupt. Imagine a sink filling with dirty water. If all you do is tighten the faucet without cleaning the water already in the basin, do you really fix the problem, or just change where it leaks out? That is what happened across much of the country. Because of the sudden pressure, some clinicians began abruptly tapering long-term patients, or cutting them off entirely. People who had taken high-dose opioids for years woke up to find their prescriptions slashed, their pain uncontrolled, their bodies in withdrawal. Many were not wealthy, did not have easy access to specialists or rehab. Some turned to the only market that never asked for prior authorization: heroin, then fentanyl, cheaper, stronger, deadlier. So the rules changed, and yet the crisis mutated. It's an example of what happens when a system tries to regulate the supply without fully reckoning with the demand, the despair, and the profit engine still humming in the background. Because even as prescription pills came under tighter control, another, even more dangerous wave was already building offshore. That second wave crashed hardest on the ground, in places that had already been hollowed out by pills and poverty. When fentanyl hit, it exposed a brutal truth. This wasn't just a crisis of chemistry, it was a crisis of survival. So the response had to change too. There was a time when treatment meant a detox bed, a prayer, and a warning not to come back. Now on the front lines, the gold standard looks very different. Medication-assisted treatment, or MAT, uses drugs like methadone, buprenorphine, and extended-release naltrexone to steady the brain, calm withdrawal, and quiet the relentless cravings that OxyContin helped unleash. People on methadone or buprenorphine are far less likely to overdose, far less likely to die. Multiple studies show their risk of death drops by more than half. It doesn't look dramatic. It looks like someone taking a dose every morning and then finally making it to work, to court, to their kids' school play. In a small clinic that used to be a video rental store, a line forms before dawn. A former construction worker, a grandmother, a teenager in a hoodie. Different lives, same story. Each dose of methadone or buprenorphine is a quiet rebellion against the gravity of relapse, against a drug market that keeps pushing them toward fentanyl. It's an example of what happens when medicine is used to stabilize a life instead of to supercharge an empire of profit. But even MAT only works if people stay alive long enough to reach it. That's where harm reduction comes in, and this is where the contrast turns at times inspiring and at times chilling. Volunteers hand out naloxone kits at libraries, fast food parking lots, county fairs. One spray in the nose can pull someone back from the edge of death in seconds. Syringe service programs trade clean needles for used ones, test drugs for fentanyl, teach people not to use alone, to start with a smaller dose, to recognize the blue lips and slow breathing that mean it's time to act. On paper, these programs are controversial. On the sidewalk, they are triage. A church basement in West Virginia becomes a drop-in center with coffee, peer counselors, and a cardboard box full of naloxone. A tribal nation in the Northwest trains grandmothers to reverse overdoses. A rural sheriff locks up fewer people and quietly keeps a case of Narcan in every patrol car. His story is one of reluctant evolution, from tough on crime to keep them breathing. And yet, look at the ledger. Purdue and its peers pulled in tens of billions of dollars from opioid sales, while many of these frontline programs scrape by on grants that have to be renewed every year, bake sales and donations in a plastic jar by the register. The money that helped fuel the epidemic moved in armored trucks and wire transfers. The money trying to repair it often arrives in envelopes. Communities are improvising an answer with peer recovery centers, sober housing, and phone trees where one text can summon a ride to detox. Families who once hid addiction now run support groups in school gyms. There was a time when the shame stayed behind closed doors. Now the grief is public, and so is the determination. Yet even as these local networks fight to rebuild, the pharmaceutical engine does not simply shut off. It retools, rebrands, searches for the next blockbuster. The question is not just how communities respond, but what patterns of power and profit are still moving quietly in the background, setting up the next crisis before this one has even ended. The engine keeps moving, and it is already looking for the next miracle. There was a time when OxyContin itself was sold with that same shimmering promise: modern, targeted, safe. Today, that glow has shifted to other products. Weight loss injections that melt pounds, new psychiatric meds that promise balance, novel pain treatments that whisper relief without risk, different drugs, same dream. On television and in social feeds, they arrive wrapped in bright colors and soft lighting. A patient laughing with family, a doctor nodding with serene confidence. Then, under the music, the warning label races by in a compressed blur of side effects, liver damage, suicidal thoughts, rare deaths. It is an example of what happens when marketing is loud and danger is whispered. The ad ends, the logo lingers, the fine print vanishes. Let me take you back to Purdue's playbook for a second. They didn't just pitch a pill, they sponsored education. They paid for pain seminars, glossy brochures, speaker fees, continuing education courses that looked neutral but tilted the message. Now look around, weight loss drugs anchored by expert panels on morning shows. Sponsored webinars explaining that a new injectable is not vanity, it is health. Psychiatric medications introduced through foundation grants, patient advocacy groups, and online quizzes that quietly funnel viewers toward a brand. Behind many of these breakthroughs sits the same quiet money. Industry funds the clinical trials, helps write the protocols, shapes which outcomes are primary, and which are politely ignored. If a side effect threatens the empire, it can be defined as rare, moved to an appendix, or explained away as unrelated. Positive trials race into journals and press releases. Negative trials sit in a drawer, unpublished, forgotten. Because of these financial ties between companies, researchers, and even regulators, the story told to doctors can be at times inspiring and at times chilling. This doesn't mean every new drug is a lie. Insulin saved lives. Antidepressants pulled people back from the edge. Some of these new weight loss injections genuinely reduce cardiovascular risk and extend life. But when billions of dollars are on the line, when executives are rewarded for chasing the next blockbuster, the pressure to smooth the rough edges never really disappears. It quietly pushes on study design, on interpretation, on what gets a press conference and what gets a footnote. So here is a pattern interrupt. Think of one drug ad you have seen this week. Anyone. Now mentally lay the Purdue template over it. The emotional story, the heroic doctor, the downplayed risk, the sponsored education. Who is paying for the message? Who profits if prescriptions explode? And who absorbs the damage if the miracle cracks? His story is one of a pill, a family name, and a nationwide epidemic. But Purdue is not an isolated villain from another era. It is a case study in what happens when money outruns oversight. As new miracle drugs rise, the question is no longer whether the old playbook will return, but where it is already being used, and who will notice in time. There was a time when the worst thing a drug company could expect was a fine. Not prison, not handcuffs, just a very large bill that could be quietly paid out of next quarter's profits. Because of that reality, the story of pharmaceutical punishment is strangely lopsided. Purdue, Johnson & Johnson, the big opioid distributors, they have paid tens of billions in settlements and agreed to monitoring, compliance programs, and public apologies. Yet among all that money and all that power, very few top executives have faced criminal charges, and almost none have actually sat in a cell. The empire takes a financial hit, the leadership keeps its freedom. Supporters of tougher criminal accountability say this is upside down. When a teenager is caught with a few pills, prison is on the table. When a CEO signs off on a strategy that floods entire regions with those same pills, the worst consequence is often a bruised reputation and a smaller bonus. It is an example of what happens when white-collar crime meets public health. The bodies are real, the punishment is abstract. For many families who lost someone, that gap feels not just unfair, but obscene. So the argument builds. If executives knew they could go to prison for pushing dangerously addictive drugs with misleading claims, maybe the next miracle pill would be launched with fewer lies and more caution. The threat of handcuffs, not just headlines, could become part of the risk calculation inside every boardroom. His story is one of a pill and an epidemic, but to critics, it is also a story about how painless it can be to profit from pain. But there is another camp, and it is loud in Washington and in corporate law firms. They warn that sending executives to prison for public health failures could chill innovation, scare away the very people needed to run complex research machines. Drug development is messy, they say, and side effects can appear years later. How do you prove intent or even reckless disregard in a maze of memos, consultants, and regulatory sign-offs? At times inspiring and at times chilling, the pharmaceutical world can look less like a single villain and more like a system that rewards everyone for not asking too many questions. That is where new proposals enter. Some legal scholars want a clear standard of reckless disregard for public health, where executives can be charged if they push a drug while ignoring glaring red flags. Others point to corporate manslaughter laws used in workplace disasters, arguing they should apply when a company's conduct predictably leads to mass overdose deaths. Let me take you back to the idea that a corporation is a person in the eyes of the law. If that is true, then what happens when that person kills on a massive scale? Yet even if a few executives were finally led away in handcuffs, another question hangs in the air. Would that change the incentives that created this crisis, or just give the public a satisfying villain while the deeper machinery keeps turning quietly in the background? The deeper machinery shows up when the handcuffs come off and the calculators come out. Headlines scream billion-dollar settlements, politicians claim victory, and it sounds like the empire has finally paid. But look a little closer at the money, and the story turns at times inspiring and at times chilling. Large settlements do not fall from the sky. They are carved out of corporate cash reserves, drawn from insurance policies written years before, and crucially pledged against future earnings. Purdue's proposed bankruptcy deal, for example, was not just about what the company had on hand. It was about squeezing value from any remaining products, then channeling that stream into a giant pot labeled opioid abatement. On paper, that sounds righteous. In practice, it means the machine keeps running a little longer, only now the harm is supposed to fund the healing. Across the country, there was a time when states and counties lined up to claim their share of that healing. Settlements with Purdue and other opioid makers created abatement funds and trusts, legal buckets meant to catch billions and pour them into treatment beds, prevention campaigns, and long-term recovery services. The idea was simple and powerful. Turn the profits of a ruthless marketing campaign into Narcan on police belts, counselors in schools, and medication-assisted treatment in clinics that had once been flooded with samples of OxyContin. But money is power, and power rarely sits quietly. Local officials suddenly found themselves with windfalls larger than their annual budgets. Lobbyists appeared. Old wish lists resurfaced. New arenas, road repairs, pension gaps, all began to compete with detox centers and sober housing. It's an example of what happens when a public health catastrophe collides with everyday political temptation. The tobacco settlements of the 1990s were supposed to fund anti-smoking efforts. Much of that wealth went elsewhere. The fear is that opioid money will follow the same well-paved road. And then there is the question of who actually pays. When Purdue agrees to billions, individual executives rarely empty their personal bank accounts. Insurance absorbs some blows, but shareholders, bondholders, and future customers quietly absorb the rest through lower returns. layoffs, or higher prices on unrelated drugs. The people who bought cough syrup or arthritis pills may be subsidizing the cost of a crisis they never touched. The life of the corporation goes on. The family that designed the playbook often walks away with its private fortune largely intact. So here's the pattern interrupt. If the people who designed the strategy don't feel the pain, what incentive do they have to avoid repeating it? Let me take you back to those courtroom negotiations for a moment. Armies of lawyers, spreadsheets, projecting profits decades ahead, arguments over how much the Sackler name should pay and how much Purdue should pay, as if they were two different beings. His story is one of aggressive risk, public ruin, and private insulation. The settlements may close one chapter, but they also raise a darker question. What happens when the cost of mass addiction becomes just another line item in the cost of doing business? When the cost of mass addiction becomes just another expense line, something else gets written off too: trust. Not only in Purdue, not only in the Sackler name, but in the entire medical empire that signed the prescriptions, approved the drugs, and told the public it was safe. There was a time when the white coat automatically meant authority, when a pill bottle meant relief rather than risk. But in the wake of OxyContin, surveys show a different landscape. Trust in pharmaceutical companies has plunged, with major polls finding that most Americans now believe Big Pharma cares more about money than medicine. In communities hollowed out by overdose, that suspicion spreads. Some patients quietly refuse pain meds after surgery, others skip appointments. Entire families decide that any prescription is a loaded gun. On one level, that skepticism looks like justice finally catching up. After all, it was the glowing brochures, the paid education dinners, the reassurances about rare addiction that helped light the fuse. But here's the cruel twist. The same distrust that shields people from one danger can push them straight into another. Because when people stop believing doctors about opioids, they often stop believing them about vaccines, antibiotics, and basic preventive care. Public health officials watch that play out in real time. Counties devastated by prescription opioids later showed higher levels of vaccine hesitancy, more conspiracy theories about government plots, more parents delaying routine childhood shots. The people who already carried the heaviest weight of poverty, unstable work, and weak clinics became the most likely to avoid care. It's an example of what happens when a system betrays its most vulnerable, then asks them to trust it again on command. Inside medicine, the backlash has been loud. Academic journals tighten conflict of interest rules. Universities force professors to disclose who pays for their education talks. Hospitals built dashboards showing which doctors prescribe the most opioids, and some banned industry-sponsored lunches entirely, a small but symbolic blow to the sales machine. Patient advocates now sit on guideline committees, telling their own story of loss, so that dosing charts are no longer written in a vacuum. Yet the tension remains. Healthy skepticism is necessary. Corrosive cynicism is lethal. Questioning the influence of drug money, demanding data, asking who profits from a new pill, all of that protects patients. But rejecting vaccines because Purdue lied about OxyContin, or ignoring evidence-based treatment because one company was ruthless, turns justified anger into collateral damage. So the question becomes, how do you rebuild faith without asking people to forget? How do you teach patients to interrogate industry spin while still trusting a flu shot or a cancer trial? The court cases against Purdue may wind down, the headlines may finally fade. But the shadow it cast over science and medicine is still moving, and in the next part of this story, that shadow starts to fall on places no one expected. That shadow did not spread into a vacuum. It moved into a culture already wired to welcome it. There was a time when the most powerful promise in American medicine was not, "We will walk with you through this," but "We can make this go away by Tuesday." Quick fixes, fast relief, no messy trade-offs. A pill for sleep, a pill for focus, a pill for grief. OxyContin just stepped into an empire that was already built. Because of that hunger for speed and certainty, a 12-hour tablet that claimed to erase severe pain without serious risk sounded less like a warning sign and more like an answered prayer. Changing diets, rebuilding communities, treating addiction, those were slow, expensive, complicated. Swallowing something before work was efficient. It fit the rhythm of a life where time was money and suffering was an inconvenience, not a signal. In that world, pain itself was quietly redefined, not as a message from a damaged body and a damaged society, but as a personal defect to be corrected. In towns hollowed out by factory closures, in regions where coal jobs vanished and wages collapsed, chronic back pain, anxiety, and insomnia were not random. They were the physical handwriting of economic decay. Yet the system treated each patient as an isolated case, not as another chapter in the same story of lost wealth and rising poverty. So doctors were told to treat the pain, not the life around it. A man whose plant shut down and whose marriage was falling apart walked out with a bottle, not with a job program or real mental health care. It's an example of what happens when a society medicalizes despair and then hands that despair to the highest bidder. There was another blind spot, colder and older. Who was suffering changed how the crisis was described. When heroin tore through black neighborhoods in the 1980s, the language was crime, war, crackdowns. When OxyContin flooded white, rural counties in the 1990s, the language shifted to tragedy, lost potential, broken families. One group met police, the other met task forces and sympathy. Same chemicals, different zip codes, different mercy. Because of that split, policy bent toward rescue in some places and punishment in others, reinforcing a quiet hierarchy of whose pain counted. His story is one of unequal compassion, written not by one family with a drug, but by a country that had been drawing those lines for generations. And under all of this sat one more weakness: complexity fatigue. The real explanation for the epidemic was messy, a tangle of deregulation, marketing, job loss, racism, and underfunded care. Much easier to say it was bad patients chasing a high or bad doctors chasing bonuses. Simple villains are comforting, systems are exhausting. Pattern interrupt for you. Which part of this story actually felt shocking, and which parts felt uncomfortably familiar? The answer to that question is a map of your own blind spots. And in the next part, those blind spots collide with communities that had been sounding the alarm long before anyone listened. There was a time when pain was just a symptom, something to be managed cautiously, feared even. Purdue and the Sackler family turned it into a product category, a brand, a growth market. They discovered that pain could be packaged in a shiny capsule, wrapped in reassuring language, and sold as liberation. The more they sold, the more the system applauded, because the pattern was simple. Take a human experience, rename it a crisis, fund the education that defines the solution, and then sell that solution as hard as possible. Purdue poured money into pain societies, sponsored more than 20,000 seminars, and told doctors that long-term opioids were not only safe, they were compassionate. sales of OxyContin exploded from tens of millions to over $1 billion a year. Every bonus check, every promotion, every glowing sales chart said the same thing: keep going. This is where greed stops looking like a cartoon villain twirling a mustache and starts looking like a regional sales manager massaging a spreadsheet. A marketer choosing the word rare instead of significant. A doctor accepting an all-expenses-paid conference and convincing himself it won't affect his judgment. It's an example of what happens when thousands of small, self-serving choices line up in the same direction. No one moment feels monstrous. The outcome is. The brutal lesson is that waiting for corporate conscience is like waiting for a pill to police its own dosage. The incentives were clear: reward higher doses, target high-prescribing doctors, ignore the red flags from pill mills and devastated towns. The safeguards were weak: an overworked FDA, underfunded monitoring programs, medical journals happy to print ghost-written articles. The empire that formed around OxyContin was not just Purdue's creation. It was a network of regulators, hospitals, insurers, and universities that all took the money and trusted the story. So, the strategy lesson is uncomfortable. Ingenuity is neutral. The same scientific brilliance that can design a time-release opioid for cancer patients can, without guardrails, engineer a public health catastrophe. His story is one of innovation, at times inspiring, and at times chilling, and Purdue's arc follows the same curve. Real pharmacology, real relief for some patients, then mission creep, marketing spin, and finally an avalanche of addiction and overdose deaths. That is why the answer cannot be, hope the next company is nicer. It has to be stronger regulation that is not captured by industry, independent research that is not bought by the sponsor, and transparency that makes it harder to hide behind slogans and selectively chosen data. When a drug is projected to make billions, the burden of proof should rise with the potential profit, not fall under it. So the question now isn't whether Purdue was wrong. That part is settled. The real question is what each person does with that knowledge inside their own life, profession, and community. Because the next crisis will not come with a Sackler label on it, and in the next chapter, the camera turns toward the people who saw this one coming and were ignored. So what does anyone do with a story like this? A family, a company, a pill, and an empire of pain that reached into almost every town in America. It would be very easy to watch, feel angry for 10 minutes, and then go back to life as usual. That is exactly how the next miracle gets through the door. There was a time when opioids were treated like fire, dangerous, controlled, handled with tongs. Then the sales pitch changed. The charts looked clean, and the guardrails quietly disappeared. So the first move now is brutally simple. Learn the fire drills. That means understanding what these drugs are, how addiction really works, and why less than 1% was always a fantasy. Talk about it with family, especially teenagers and older relatives. Check the bathroom cabinet, lock up what is needed, return what is not. Pharmacies, police stations, and take-back days exist for a reason. A forgotten bottle is how many tragedies begin. Because of how Purdue rewrote medical culture, safe prescribing can no longer be left only to doctors. Patients have to ask harder questions. How long is this for? What are the non-opioid options? What happens if the pills run out and the pain stays? A 30-second conversation can be the thin line between a short-term prescription and a long-term disaster. But knowledge sitting in one house is not enough. Across the country, there are underfunded methadone clinics, needle exchanges in church basements, and recovery homes run by exhausted volunteers who watch the overdose numbers climb anyway. Supporting them is not glamorous. It is not a naming rights level of charity. Yet a monthly donation, a weekend of volunteering or even driving someone to an appointment is the opposite of what Purdue did. It is using money and time to quietly pull people back from the edge instead of pushing them toward it. And then there is the money already on the table. Tens of billions in opioid settlement funds are flowing through state treasuries and county boards right now. Not theoretical, not someday, now. Because of that, school board, city councils, and obscure advisory committees suddenly control more power than some drug companies. If residents are not in those rooms asking how the cash is spent, the old pattern returns. Consultants get rich, headlines fade, and the next crisis finds the same broken system waiting. For anyone in healthcare, law, finance, advertising, or tech, his story is one of professional mirrors. Purdue did not act alone. It needed sales reps, key opinion leaders, lax regulators, rating agencies, and data dashboards that rewarded volume over safety. So this is the moment to look at bonus structures, marketing claims, and educational events in every industry and ask, who gets hurt if this all goes wrong? Here is the pattern interrupt. This is not charity for them, the addicted strangers off in the distance. It is self-defense. It is an example of what happens when systems are designed to serve quarterly wealth instead of long-term life. The next drug, device, or app will also promise relief without risk. The question is whether families, towns, and professions have quietly rebuilt enough guardrails to say no. Because the people who saw this coming and were ignored? In the next chapter, they become the map for what resistance looks like when the empire is still rising, not already falling. Those guardrails are important. But in a world where pain was rebranded into a $30 billion business, personal guardrails matter too. This is where the empire reaches into the exam room and where patients either sign on the dotted line or start reading the fine print. There was a time when a prescription pad felt like pure authority. Doctor writes, pharmacy fills, family trusts. Today, in a system shaped by marketing, money, and quiet pressure, the smartest patients treat every new pill as a contract with their future life. When a new medication is offered, especially something powerful for chronic pain, the first question is simple. What is the evidence this is safe long-term, not just for a few weeks? Not the brochure line, actual years of follow-up. Then comes the second layer. Are there non-drug options that were tried first or could be tried alongside? Physical therapy, injections, cognitive tools, even changing work demands. If the answer is, there's no time for that, that is not a medical fact. That is a system under pressure. And when the drug on the table is an opioid for non-cancer pain, one more question becomes non-negotiable. What is the potential for dependence? And what is the plan to taper, not just to start? Because of how OxyContin was sold, because addiction was framed as rare, while internal memos said otherwise, second opinions are not an insult. They are survival. A patient can ask for another clinician to review a long-term opioid plan, especially when doses are rising or the prescription has quietly stretched from months into years. In many states, prescription drug monitoring programs, or PDMPs, track controlled substances. A patient can ask the doctor to pull up that record and walk through it together, line by line, to catch dangerous overlaps before they become headlines. It's an example of what happens when power and marketing seep into guidelines too. The same way Purdue funded pain societies, speakers, and education, modern care is shaped by experts who may be swimming in industry money. Patients can look up conflicts of interest, checking the open payments database in the United States for money from drug companies to their doctor, searching journals for disclosure statements on the guidelines that justify their treatment, even Googling the conference where a charismatic speaker declared a pill safe. Sometimes the footnotes tell a different story than the stage lights. Yet, this is not a call to treat every doctor as a villain. Most are trying to help, trapped between patient suffering, time limits, and a reimbursement machine that rewards prescriptions over long conversations. Trust still matters, but it becomes a grown-up trust, one that understands even good people operate inside incentives they did not design. At times inspiring and at times chilling, individual vigilance can change a single prescription, a single family, a single trajectory away from addiction. But without broader change, it's like carefully reading the fine print on a contract everyone else is still signing blind. And in the next chapter, the story turns to what happens when a few people refuse to sign at all and decide to go after the contract writers instead. Those contract writers never lived in the same world as the people signing. Their world was quieter, more polished, marble lobbies, museum wings, conference rooms. But let me take you back to where this story really began, a beige suburban bathroom, a mirrored door swinging open, and a plastic orange bottle with a name that now feels radioactive. There was a time when that bottle looked harmless. A pill for a bad back after construction work, a prescription for a mom after a C-section, a teenager's wisdom tooth pain. One pill, swallowed in the silence of a morning routine, felt small, private. But behind that moment was an empire of marketing, money, and power that had been decades in the making. Arthur Sackler never touched OxyContin, but his story is one of cause and effect. He rewrote pharmaceutical advertising, turning doctors into targets, journals into billboards, and education into sales. Those ideas survived him. They were weaponized by his brothers and their heirs when Purdue Pharma pushed a new extended-release opioid through the FDA in 1995, then told the country it was safe, modern, and, conveniently, less addictive. From there, the arc was brutally fast. A sales blitz that sent reps to 20,000 pain conferences. Coupons for free starter prescriptions. Charts claiming addiction rates under 1%. Purdue tracked high-prescribing doctors, courted known pill mills, and turned rural clinics into OxyContin fountains. Because of that ruthless focus on volume and loyalty, small towns watched disability checks, workers' comp claims, and casual injuries morph into physical dependence. And the cabinet changed. The same shelves that once held aspirin and cough syrup now hid time-release OxyContin. When the pills ran out, some people drove hours to the next lenient doctor. Others crushed and snorted what they had left. When prescriptions finally stopped, heroin stepped in, then fentanyl. The hollowed-out Main Street, the boarded pharmacy, the memorial posters on a church bulletin board were not random tragedies. They were downstream from a business plan. Yet this story is not as simple as villains and victims. Real pain existed. Surgeons wanted their patients walking sooner. Family doctors were told they had been cruelly undertreating suffering. Regulators faced pressure to treat pain as the fifth vital sign. Personal responsibility, medical uncertainty, and genuine desperation all coexisted with corporate manipulation and regulatory failure, at times inspiring and at times chilling in how easily good intentions were steered. So the contrast remains, one quiet hand reaching into a cabinet, and behind it, a vast machine of sales quotas, sponsored guidelines, and sanitized language about rare addiction. It's an example of what happens when profit quietly rewrites the definition of care. Here's the pattern interrupt. This doesn't end with Purdue. The company is in bankruptcy court. The family name is coming off museum walls. But the playbook, aggressive detailing, captured experts, miracle claims, did not die in those filings. The next move in this story doesn't belong to a boardroom. It belongs to whoever opens the cabinet next. That means the center of the empire shifts, for a moment to the viewer, to the patient who asks one more question, to the doctor who checks one more source, to the voter who reads one more line in a settlement. Because what happens next will not be decided by a single pill or a single company, but by how many people refuse to sign the next contract blind. And that contract is not just legal, it is cultural. It lives in the way people still say, they should have known better, as if hundreds of thousands of overdoses were simply a mass failure of willpower instead of a warning about money, power, and spin. So here's the first ask. Share this story with one person who still talks about the opioid crisis, mainly as a tale of bad choices. Someone who thinks the problem starts and ends with junkies and weak characters. Because there was a time when OxyContin sat on shelves with the word safe hovering over it like a halo, and respectable doctors, desperate families, and straight-A teenagers swallowed that promise whole. This isn't just a story of individual life decisions. It's an example of what happens when an empire of marketing rewrites the definition of pain itself. But forwarding a link is only the beginning. The real leverage sits much closer to home than a federal courtroom. County commissions, local health boards, state legislatures. That is where treatment budgets are cut or expanded, where harm reduction sites are banned or approved, where prescription monitoring programs are quietly weakened or finally given teeth. The next time a ballot shows up or a town hall meeting looks painfully boring, remember who profits when no one is watching. The Sacklers needed a captured system. The sequel depends on whether that system stays captured. Engagement here is not abstract. It looks like showing up when your city debates funding for a detox center instead of another jail wing. It looks like asking a candidate on camera whether they support needle exchanges or medication-assisted treatment, and refusing to let them slide by with a slogan. It looks like serving on a hospital advisory board, or even just submitting a public comment when your state quietly reworks opioid prescribing rules at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. Then there are the small, unglamorous moves that never make headlines but quietly change the odds. Go through the medicine cabinet. Find the half-used painkillers from a surgery 3 years ago, take them to a verified drug take-back site or a police station drop box instead of leaving them as a loaded gun in pill form. Look up local helplines and treatment resources now before anyone in your circle needs them, so panic is not the moment you start to learn the map and talk. Not in whispers, not only after a funeral. Have one honest conversation this week with a friend, a parent, a teenager about pain and addiction, and how quickly a prescription can slide from relief to dependence. There was a time when families trusted every white coat in the room. Now, the safest families are the ones who ask hard questions together, because the goal is not to fear every pill. Pain medicine saves lives, preserves dignity, lets people work and sleep and be present with their family. The goal is to demand systems where truth, not spin, decides what ends up in those orange bottles, where less than 1% addicted is treated as a red flag, not a slogan, where a drug story is written by real data and real patients, not just by a sales force with quarterly targets. Let me take you back to one more boardroom image before we move on. Somewhere right now, a different company is unveiling slides about a revolutionary treatment, promising low risk and high reward, rehearsing lines about undertreated conditions and compassionate care. The faces change. The playbook does not. And that is why your role matters, because the next safe miracle is already being pitched somewhere. The question is whether we'll recognize the playbook in time. And while that next miracle is being pitched, something is missing from those slides. The names of the people who never walk into another appointment. The faces that never make it into the glossy case studies, only into quiet living rooms and funeral programs. There was a time when this whole crisis was presented as a graph. Overdose curves, prescription trends, mortality rates climbing like some abstract economic chart. But behind every statistic is a life that did not feel abstract at all. A teenager who took what a doctor handed over and never imagined it would end with paramedics in the driveway. A grandfather who followed the label, then found the label following him into every corner of his day. This story is not just about a company, a drug, or even an empire of money and power. His story is one of numbers on balance sheets. Theirs is one of unfinished birthdays, empty chairs at Thanksgiving, text messages that will never get a reply. It is at times inspiring and at times chilling to see how quickly a pill can move through a market, and how slowly a family learns to live with the silence it leaves. Because for every person lost, there is a circle left behind. Parents who keep a bedroom untouched for years. Children being raised by grandparents who never planned to start over at 70. Towns where the pharmacy is still open, but half the storefronts are not. The news cameras move on to the next crisis. The consequences stay, making coffee every morning, paying bills, explaining to a 7-year-old why mom is not coming back. Some watching this are not just observers. The crisis is not a documentary. It is the reason for the pill bottles on the nightstand, the court dates, the late-night arguments, the bank account drained to zero. To anyone in that position, hear this clearly. The shame is not yours to carry. Addiction thrives in silence, and that silence protects the same systems that sold less than 1% addiction risk while counting record revenue. Reaching out for help is not weakness. It is an act of resistance in a world that would rather keep certain stories off the record. A call to a friend, a support group, a therapist, a recovery program, even a blunt conversation with someone trusted is one way of saying the damage stops here. So remembrance cannot be passive. It is not just candles, hashtags, and a yearly vigil. It is a decision to pay attention when a new cure is hailed as game-changing, to ask harder questions when a sales rep promises low risk and high reward, to recognize that when money and pain meet, the result can be ruthless. Let me take you back to that conference room for a moment. The pitch ends, the applause fades. On the screen, a projected market share. Off the screen, a projected body count no one dares to calculate. That is where quiet resolve has to live, not an outrage that burns hot and disappears. In the stillness after the video ends, when the viewer decides to remember the invisible victims and to refuse the easy answers the next time a miracle arrives, then and only then does this story finally change direction. That decision point is where outrage has to turn into something else. Not just anger at a family name or a company logo, but a plan for what to do next when the screen goes dark and real life comes back in. So let me take you back to the most important line in this entire story. No one is disposable. If someone watching this is in crisis or loves someone who is, there are people whose entire job is to pick up that call. In the United States, the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline runs 24/7. For overdose risk, local emergency numbers still matter, but so do harm reduction lines, syringe service programs, and naloxone distribution centers that quietly reverse deaths every single day, while the empire of pain keeps counting money. There was a time when addiction treatment meant a locked ward or nothing. Now there are medication-assisted treatment clinics, buprenorphine prescribers, and methadone programs that, when done right, pull people back from the cliff. National treatment locators, like the ones run by public health agencies, can filter by insurance, medication type, and distance so a family is not left cold calling random numbers. It is not perfect. It is not evenly distributed, but it is there, and those links sit in the description waiting for the moment someone finally decides to use them. Because of how ruthless this crisis has been, knowledge itself becomes a form of harm reduction. For anyone who wants to go deeper into how Purdue and the Sacklers built this machine, there are investigative books that read like crime novels, documentaries that follow the lawsuits and the museum protests, and long reports that map the overdose curves county by county. They show internal emails, sales graphs, and the quiet boardroom signatures that turned a single pill into a national catastrophe. It's an example of what happens when marketing budgets outrun ethics, and when regulators believe the sales pitch more than the bodies. The description holds more than citations. It points to organizations fighting on 3 fronts at once: direct addiction care, policy reform, and patient advocacy. Warnings. Some lobby to cap prescription marketing. Some push for wider access to naloxone and safe-use sites. Some sit with grieving parents and help them navigate court dates and obituaries. Their work is at times inspiring and at times chilling, because every win is measured against a death toll that never quite stops rising. Down in the comments, this story does not need more blame without action. What actually helps are constructive questions, lived experiences shared with care, and ideas for future deep dives into other miracles that reshaped whole systems, from wonder drugs to financial innovations to technologies that promised freedom and delivered new kinds of dependence. This channel exists to take those miracles apart, to follow the money, the power, the quiet paperwork, and show how an empire is built one small decision at a time. Long-form storytelling is the tool. Decoding how power really works is the mission. One miracle at a time.